The evening sun cast long shadows across the airport terminal as Anthony Reynolds adjusted his backpack strap over his shoulder. He was tired, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from back-to-back meetings and too many handshakes. His comfortable jeans and faded navy hoodie felt like a blessing after 3 days of stiff suits and forced smiles. "Last flight of the day to Chicago, now boarding at Gate 17, announced the overhead speaker. Anthony glanced at his watch and picked up his pace. He'd built Horizon Airways from nothing but a dream and his military pension, but most days he preferred to travel like any other passenger. It wasn't about being secretive, it was about seeing the real experience. How could he know if his company truly lived up to its promises if everyone knew who he was? The gate area buzzed with the usual mix of tired business travelers and families. Anthony handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who smiled professionally without a second glance at the priority boarding status or the name that matched the one on the company's headquarters. "Have a good flight, sir," she said, already looking past him to the next passenger. Anthony walked down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar sense of pride as he approached the aircraft with his company's logo emblazoned on its side. 15 years in the Air Force had given him a love of flight, but it was the years after, building something of his own, that had given him purpose. He found his seat in the first-class cabin, not because he enjoyed luxury, but because it gave him the best opportunity to observe the entire aircraft. Ticket 3A, window seat. Anthony stowed his backpack under the seat in front and settled in, pulling out a dog-eared paperback. A few other passengers filtered into the cabin. A businessman talking too loudly on his phone. An elderly couple helping each other with their bags. A young woman who looked like she might be flying for the first time, eyes wide with excitement. Anthony smiled to himself. This was why he'd started Horizon Airways, to create a place where flying felt special again, where everyone was treated with the same respect regardless of who they were or where they came from. He'd seen too much of the world during his military service to believe that worth had anything to do with appearance or background. He opened his book but found himself instead watching his crew at work. 2 flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, helping passengers and checking seatbelts. He recognized Lee, the flight's captain, through the open cockpit door. They'd served together years ago, before either of them had dreamed of where they'd end up. Anthony had just started to relax when he noticed her, a flight attendant he didn't recognize. She moved through the cabin with a stiff precision that reminded him of new recruits trying too hard to impress their drill sergeants. Her name read Valerie, and something about her tight smile made Anthony pay closer attention. She stopped at the row across from him, helping an older gentleman with his overhead bag. Professional, but cold. No warmth in her voice as she recited the standard welcome. When she turned and saw Anthony, something shifted in her expression. A slight narrowing of the eyes. A pursing of the lips. So subtle most people would miss it. But Anthony had spent 20 years reading people's faces in situations where misreading could mean disaster. He gave her a friendly nod, the same one he'd give any crew member. Valerie didn't nod back. Instead, she looked at his hoodie, his worn jeans, his scuffed boots, then at the first-class seat he occupied. Her expression heightened further. Anthony sighed internally. He'd been here before, too many times to count. The assumption, the judgment, the feeling of being seen as out of place in a space he'd literally created. He didn't know it yet, but the next 30 minutes would become a turning point for his airline, his crew, and his own personal journey. The quiet evening flight he'd hoped for was about to become something else entirely. Valerie pushed her service cart down the aisle, her back straight as a ruler. She'd been with Horizon Airways for 8 years and prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged where. First class had rules, standards. That's what made it special. She paused beside Anthony's seat, her polished smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Excuse me, sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Anthony looked up from his book, his expression calm despite the familiar feeling settling in his stomach. He'd been here before, too many times. "Of course," he said, reaching for the pass tucked in his book. He handed it to her. Valerie examined the pass with exaggerated care, turning it over as though a forgery might reveal itself if she just looked hard enough. Her eyes darted between the paper and Anthony's worn hoodie. "Is there a problem?" Anthony asked, his voice level but firm. Well, Valerie said, loud enough that passengers in nearby seats turned to look. It seems there might have been a mix-up at the gate. This is the first-class cabin. Anthony nodded. Yes, I know. That's my seat assignment. He pointed to the clearly printed seat number on the boarding pass still in her hand. Valerie's lips thinned. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the main cabin? First class has a certain atmosphere we try to maintain. The businessman across the aisle looked up from his phone. The elderly couple a few rows ahead turned around. A tense silence fell over the front of the plane. I'm quite comfortable here, thank you, Anthony replied. 20 years of military discipline kept his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. As you can see, that's my assigned seat. Valerie handed back the boarding pass with 2 fingers, as if touching it too fully might soil her hand. Very well, but I'll need to check with the gate agent about this unusual situation. She walked away, but not far enough that Anthony couldn't hear her whisper to another flight attendant, "Can you believe they let him in here? Probably used points or got some discount fare." These people always try to gang the system. The second flight attendant, a younger woman with kind eyes, looked uncomfortable. Val, maybe we should just... No, Valerie cut her off. I know the type. Trust me. Anthony took a deep breath and returned to his book, though the words swam before his eyes. He built Horizon Airways specifically to fight against this kind of treatment. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was experiencing it on his own airline. Valerie returned a moment later with a forced smile. "Sir, while we're sorting this out, would you mind moving to economy class? We have a nice seat available by the window." The businessman across the aisle put down his phone. "Excuse me," he said to Valerie, "but is there some issue? This gentleman was here before me, and I didn't see you questioning anyone else's seating assignment." Valerie's smile tightened. "This is a private matter, sir. I'm just trying to ensure everyone is where they belong." "And where exactly do you think I belong?" Anthony asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Several passengers were now openly watching. Someone in row 5 had their phone out recording. "I'm simply doing my job," Valerie said, her voice rising slightly. "First class has certain standards and What standards would those be?" Anthony asked. "Because I've read the Horizon Airways employee handbook cover to cover, and I don't recall a dress code for passengers anywhere in it." Valerie blinked, thrown off by his specific knowledge of company policy. Well, it's just that normally first-class passengers are more professionally dressed." "I see," Anthony said. "And this policy about clothing, is that something you enforce with all passengers, or just ones who look like me?" The cabin had gone completely silent now. Even the background noise of boarding seemed to have paused. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Lee stepped out, scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on Anthony, widened in recognition, then moved to Valerie's flushed face. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the natural authority of both a captain and a former military officer. Valerie straightened her uniform jacket. "No problem, Captain. Just a small misunderstanding about seating assignments." Lee's eyes moved back to Anthony, and for a moment something passed between them, 20 years of shared history in a single glance. "I see," said Lee. "And what exactly is the misunderstanding?" The tension in the first-class cabin could have been cut with a knife. Captain Lee stood in the aisle, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. Anthony sitting calmly in his seat, Valerie with her arms crossed defensively, and at least a dozen passengers watching with undisguised interest. "Well?" Lee prompted when Valerie didn't immediately answer. "What seems to be the issue with this passenger's seating?" Valerie smoothed her uniform skirt, visibly uncomfortable now that the captain was involved. "I was just explaining to this gentleman that there might have been a mix-up with his boarding pass." "A mix-up," Lee repeated flatly. "Yes," Valerie continued, her voice taking on a rehearsed customer service tone that rang false to everyone listening. "I noticed he seemed out of place in first class, so I was offering him a seat in economy where he might feel more at home." A woman 2 rows back gasped audibly. The businessman across the aisle shook his head in disgust. The young flight attendant who had been standing behind Valerie took a small step back, as if trying to distance herself from what was happening. Anthony remained still, his expression carefully neutral despite the public humiliation unfolding around him. Decades of facing similar situations had taught him that his reaction would be scrutinized more closely than the behavior that provoked it. Out of place? Lee echoed, his eyebrows rising. Could you explain what you mean by that exactly? Valerie glanced around, suddenly aware of how many people were watching. Several phones were now recording the interaction, their camera lenses like accusing eyes. Well, his attire is very casual, she said, gesturing vaguely at Anthony's hoodie and jeans. And he seemed confused about the boarding process. I was simply trying to assist. I see, said Lee, his tone making it clear that he saw far more than Valerie realized. So this is about his clothes. And his general demeanor, Valerie added, digging herself deeper. First class has standards, Captain. I'm sure you understand. An older woman sitting nearby couldn't contain herself any longer. Oh, for heaven's sake. I'm wearing sweatpants, and she didn't say a word to me when I boarded. The cabin erupted in murmurs. Someone toward the back called out, "This is ridiculous." Lee held up a hand, restoring quiet with the natural authority of a captain. "Sir," he said, addressing Anthony with perfect professionalism, though a hint of something else flickered in his eyes. "Has this flight attendant asked to see your boarding pass?" "Twice," Anthony replied calmly. "She's examined it quite thoroughly both times." "May I?" Lee asked, extending his hand. Anthony passed over his boarding pass once more, watching as Lee made a show of examining it. "Everything appears to be in order," Lee announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Seat 3A, first class, properly issued." He handed the pass back to Anthony with a respectful nod. Valerie's face had turned a mottled red. "But Captain, I was just following." "Following what, exactly?" Lee cut in. "Which company policy states that we judge our passengers based on their clothing, or perhaps other visible characteristics?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Nobody moved. "I think," Lee continued, "we should discuss this further after we reach cruising altitude." He turned to the rest of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. We'll be taking off shortly." As Lee turned to head back to the cockpit, Valerie stepped forward, unwilling to let it go. "Captain, with all due respect, I've been with this airline for 8 years. I know what's best for maintaining the first-class experience. This man clearly doesn't fit the profile of our typical..." "Profile?" Anthony spoke for the first time since Lee had arrived, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the cabin instantly. "What exactly is the profile of a Horizon Airways first-class passenger, Ms. Valerie? Could you explain that to me? To all of us?" Phones lifted higher, recording every word. Valerie faltered, suddenly aware she was standing on a precipice. "I simply meant fat." "Because," Anthony continued, "I've always believed that the profile of a Horizon Airways passenger in any cabin was simply a person who purchased a ticket. Nothing more, nothing less." A few passengers nodded in agreement. Someone in the back started to applaud but quickly stopped when Anthony held up his hand. "I'm not looking for applause," he said. "I'm looking for an explanation. Because if Horizon Airways has a different policy, a different profile they're looking for, then a lot of people need to know about it, starting with me." The way he said "me" carried an undercurrent that made Valerie take an instinctive step back. "Who exactly are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Lee, who had paused at the cockpit door, turned back with a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Valerie," he said, "I'd like you to meet Anthony Reynolds." The name hung in the air for a moment. "The Anthony Reynolds?" asked the businessman across the aisle, recognition dawning on his face. Lee nodded. "Founder, CEO, and majority owner of Horizon Airways, and my former commanding officer." The cabin fell into a stunned silence as Valerie's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, and she gripped the back of a nearby seat to steady herself. "Mr. Reynolds," she finally managed to stammer. "I had no idea. I never would have." Anthony raised his hand gently. "Let's not discuss this further right now. We have a plane full of passengers who would like to take off on time." Captain Lee nodded and addressed the rest of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be closing the doors shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and all electronic devices are in airplane mode. As Lee returned to the cockpit, the other flight attendant, the younger one who had looked uncomfortable earlier, stepped forward. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm Diane. I'm so sorry about this situation. Would you like anything before takeoff? Water? Coffee?" Anthony gave her a genuine smile. "Water would be fine, thank you, Diane." Valerie stood frozen in the aisle, her perfect posture now crumpled with the weight of what had just happened. The passengers who had been recording the incident were still holding their phones, though most had lowered them now. The businessman across the aisle was typing furiously on his phone, likely sharing what he'd just witnessed with someone or everyone in his contacts. "Valerie," Anthony said quietly, "the other passengers need your assistance. We can talk after the flight." His words seemed to snap her out of her shock. She nodded jerkily and moved down the aisle, her usual confident stride replaced by stiff, robotic movements. Every passenger she passed watched her with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. As the cabin crew prepared for takeoff, whispers spread throughout the plane. By the time they reached cruising altitude, everyone on board knew what had happened. Flight attendants from economy class found excuses to walk through first class, stealing glances at Anthony. The story was traveling faster than the airplane itself. Diane served Anthony his water with a respectful nod. "Mr. Reynolds, I want you to know that what happened doesn't represent all of us. Most of us are proud to work for Horizon." Anthony took the water with a smile. "I know that, Diane. One person's actions don't define an entire company." "Still," she said, lowering her voice, "a lot of us have noticed how Valerie treats certain passengers. Some of us have tried to say something, but she's been here 8 years. Anthony finished for her. "Seniority carries weight. I understand." Diane nodded gratefully. "Exactly. Thank you for understanding." As she moved on to serve other passengers, Anthony turned to look out the window. Below, cities and towns passed by, tiny specks of light in the gathering dusk. He'd started Horizon Airways with a vision, to create an airline where everyone was treated with dignity, where his own experiences as a black man who was constantly underestimated and judged would not be repeated in the lives of his passengers or employees. Had he failed? Or was this a moment that could make Horizon stronger? The businessman across the aisle interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, Mr. Reynolds. I'm Robert Chen from Global Investments." Anthony turned, recognizing the name. Global Investments managed pension funds for several large corporations, including some that had travel contracts with Horizon. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Chen," Anthony replied, extending his hand. Chen shook it firmly. "I have to say, I'm impressed by how you handled that situation. Most CEOs I know would have fired her on the spot, publicly and loudly." "That wouldn't solve the real problem," Anthony said. "Maybe not," Chen agreed, "but it would have been satisfying to watch." Anthony smiled slightly. "Maybe for a moment. But tomorrow, we'd still wake up in a world where people make the same assumptions, where the same biases exist. Firing one flight attendant doesn't change that." Chen studied him thoughtfully. "So what will you do?" It was the question Anthony had been asking himself since the confrontation began. What could he do that would make a real difference? Not just a band-aid on a symptom, but a treatment for the underlying disease. Before he could answer, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and Captain Lee's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The weather ahead looks clear, and we should arrive in Chicago on schedule. And if I may add a personal note," his voice took on a warmer tone, "it's an honor to have Horizon Airways founder on board with us today. Some of you may not know that before Mr. Reynolds built this airline, he and I served together in the Air Force. What he created here grew from the same values he demonstrated in uniform: integrity, excellence, and respect for every person. Thank you for flying with us today." As Lee's announcement ended, a quiet round of applause spread through the cabin. Anthony nodded in acknowledgement, then turned back to Chen. "To answer your question, Mr. Chen, I don't know exactly what I'll do yet, but I know it needs to be something that matters, something that lasts." The plane began its descent into Chicago as the city lights spread out below like a glittering carpet. Anthony watched through the window, his mind still churning over the events of the flight. His phone had been buzzing nonstop for the past hour, messages from his executive team, all marked urgent. News traveled fast in the digital age. The videos were already online. Diane approached his seat, her expression concerned. "Mr. Reynolds, Captain Lee would like to speak with you after we land, if that's all right." "Of course," Anthony nodded. From the corner of his eye, he could see Valerie at the far end of the cabin, going through the motions of her pre-landing duties. Her movements were mechanical, her normally perfect smile completely absent. Twice she'd started walking toward his seat, then changed direction, courage failing her. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. Many nodded respectfully to Anthony as they passed. A few stopped to shake his hand. "Thank you for showing such dignity," said an older woman in a business suit. "My grandson is in the Air Force now. Men like you paved the way." Anthony thanked her, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with his visibility. He hadn't asked to become the center of the story, but now that he was, what would he do with it? The cabin gradually emptied until only Anthony, the flight crew, and a few stragglers remained. Captain Lee emerged from the cockpit, his face sullen. "Tony," he said, using Anthony's old nickname from their service days. "We need to talk about this." "I know," Anthony replied, standing to embrace his old friend. "But not just the two of us." He glanced meaningfully toward Valerie, who was pretending to check seat pockets while clearly listening to every word. Lee nodded in understanding. "My office at the terminal. 10 minutes." As Anthony made his way through the nearly empty airport, most flights had ended hours ago. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his PR director's name. "Hello, Grace," he answered. "Anthony, have you seen the videos? They're everywhere. CNN is calling for a statement. So is MSNBC. Even Fox picked it up. #Horizon Shame is trending on every platform." Anthony sighed. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we need to get ahead of it. Good enough that we could turn it into something positive if we handle it right. The way you kept your cool, the dignity you showed, people are responding to that. But we need a statement from you, and we need it tonight." "I'm heading to Lee's office now to speak with the flight attendant," Anthony said. "Give me an hour." "You're meeting with her?" Grace sounded surprised. "Most of the comments online are calling for her head on a platter. Which is exactly why this needs to be handled carefully. I'll call you back." He ended the call as he reached the door marked Captain's office. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. Lee opened the door immediately. Inside, Valerie sat in a chair, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked up with a mixture of fear and shame as Anthony entered. The small office felt even smaller with the tension filling it. Lee offered Anthony his chair behind the desk, but Anthony shook his head, choosing instead to sit in the chair beside Valerie. Equal ground. "Mr. Reynolds," Valerie began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't begin to express how sorry I am for my behavior. I understand if you need to fire me. I just want you to know that I never meant." Anthony held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Before we discuss what happens next, I'd like to ask you something." Valerie nodded, bracing herself. "Why did you assume I didn't belong in first class?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked down at her hands. "I don't. I never thought of myself as prejudiced," she said finally. "I have friends who are. I mean, I never used slurs or—" "That's not what I asked," Anthony said gently but firmly. "I asked why you looked at me and decided I didn't belong." The silence stretched between them. Lee leaned against the wall, watching carefully but not interfering. "I guess," Valerie struggled to find the words, "you didn't look like our usual first-class passengers. The hoodie, the jeans, and honestly, yes, the fact that you're black made me question it more. I didn't think about it consciously, but looking back, that's the truth." Her admission hung in the air. For the first time since the confrontation began, Valerie looked Anthony directly in the eyes. "I've never said that out loud before," she added quietly. "Never even admitted it to myself. But it's there, isn't it? This assumption I carry without thinking about it." Anthony nodded, a surprising sense of respect growing for her honesty. "Valerie," he said, "what would you do if you were in my position right now?" She blinked, surprised by the question. I'd fire me, she said without hesitation, immediately. That would be the easy solution, Anthony agreed. But would it solve the real problem? Valerie looked confused. I am the problem. No. Anthony shook his head. You're a symptom. The problem is much bigger than one flight attendant on one flight. He stood up and paced the small office. I built Horizon Airways on a promise of dignity for everyone. Obviously, we have work to do. He turned to face both Valerie and Lee. So here's what's going to happen. Anthony stood by the window in the captain's office, looking out at the tarmac where ground crews worked under bright lights, preparing planes for the next day's flights. Behind him, Valerie and Lee waited in tense silence for his decision. Tomorrow morning, Anthony said finally, turning to face them, I'm calling an emergency board meeting. By noon, I'll hold a press conference. The videos of what happened today are already everywhere. Valerie's shoulders slumped further. I understand. No, I don't think you do, Anthony said, his voice gaining strength, because I'm not going to fire you, Valerie. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. What? But firing you would be the easy way out, Anthony continued. It would make the public happy. It would let Horizon Airways wash its hands of the problem and move on, but it wouldn't fix anything. Lee shifted against the wall. Tony, I respect your judgment, but the PR nightmare will get worse before it gets better, Anthony nodded. I know, but I didn't build this airline to take the easy way out. He pulled out his phone and called his PR director. Grace, I need you to set up a press conference for tomorrow at noon, and I need the entire executive team in the boardroom at 8 a.m. sharp. He listened for a moment, then added, No, we're not firing her. We're doing something much bigger. I'll explain everything in the morning. After ending the call, Anthony turned back to Valerie, who was staring at him like he'd grown a second head. Why? She asked simply. Anthony took a seat across from her again. Because firing you doesn't solve anything, it just makes it someone else's problem. And because you did something important tonight, that tells me you might be part of the solution. What did I do? Valerie asked, genuinely confused. You told the truth, Anthony replied. When I asked why you singled me out, you didn't make excuses. You admitted to biases you didn't even realize you had. That's rare, Valerie. Most people go their whole lives without that kind of self-awareness. Tears welled in Valerie's eyes. But I humiliated you in front of everyone. Those videos, your reputation. My reputation will survive, Anthony said firmly. The question is, what are we going to do about the bigger problem? The one that affects thousands of passengers every day, not just airline owners who can defend themselves. Lee pushed away from the wall, suddenly understanding where Anthony was headed. You're going to use this as a turning point for the whole company. Anthony nodded. For the whole industry, if I can manage it. He looked directly at Valerie. But I'll need your help. My help? She repeated, disbelief clear in her voice. Yes, because you're going to stand beside me at that press conference tomorrow. You're going to tell your story, not as a villain, but as someone who recognized her own biases and committed to changing them. The color drained from Valerie's face. You want me to admit what I did on national television? I want you to help me turn this incident into something meaningful, Anthony corrected. I'm announcing a new company-wide training program tomorrow. Every employee, from baggage handlers to pilots to executives, will go through it. And you'll help design it, Valerie. You'll share your experience. You'll help others see what you saw tonight. He leaned forward, his expression intense. This isn't punishment. It's purpose. It's taking something ugly and using it to create real change. Lee whistled low. Bold move, Tony. The board might push back. Let them, Anthony shrugged. I still own 51% of the company. Valerie wiped her eyes, struggling to process what was happening. You're giving me a second chance. No, Anthony said. I'm giving Horizon Airways a second chance. I'm giving our whole industry a second chance. You're just the catalyst. He stood and paced the small office again. For 20 years, I served this country in uniform. I faced discrimination then, and I face it now. The difference is that now I have the power to do something about it. He stopped and looked at Valerie. So what do you say? Are you willing to stand up tomorrow and tell the truth, even though it's hard? Are you willing to be part of the solution? The question hung in the air between them. Lee watched silently, respect for his old commander evident in his eyes. Valerie took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. "Yes, I will." Anthony extended his hand to her. "Then let's get to work. We have a press conference to prepare for." As Valerie shook his hand, her phone buzzed. She glanced down and her face paled again. "It's my mother. She says I'm on the news." "Get used to it," Anthony said with a small smile. "By this time tomorrow, we both will be." He turned to Lee. "Can you call a car for us? We need to get to headquarters. It's going to be a long night." As they gathered their things to leave, Lee put a hand on Anthony's shoulder. "This isn't what most CEOs would do, Tony." Anthony nodded. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Too many people take the easy way out. But real change is never easy." The three of them walked through the empty terminal, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Outside, the night was clear and cold, with stars visible despite the city lights. A black car waited at the curb. "Ready?" Anthony asked Valerie as the driver opened the door. She took another deep breath and nodded. "Ready." As the car pulled away from the curb, Anthony gazed out at the darkened airport. Somewhere in the distance, a plane took off, its lights blinking against the night sky. Tomorrow would bring challenges, criticism, and difficult conversations. But for the first time since the confrontation began, he felt something like hope. Sometimes it took darkness to create light. 3 months later, Anthony stood at the podium in Horizon Airways' largest training center. The room was packed with employees, journalists, and industry representatives. Bright lights from TV cameras created halos throughout the audience as he adjusted the microphone. 90 days ago, he began, many of you saw a video of me being humiliated on one of our flights. It wasn't the first time I'd experienced discrimination, but it was the first time it happened on the airline I built. The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. Today, I'm proud to announce that every single one of our 12,000 employees has completed our new Respect in Flight training program. But more importantly, I'm here to share what we've learned. He gestured to his right, where Valerie stood in her uniform, her posture straight but her expression humble. When that video went viral, thousands of people called for this flight attendant to be fired. They wanted a simple solution to a complex problem. They wanted someone to blame. Anthony paused, looking directly into the cameras. But blame doesn't create change. Punishment doesn't create understanding. Only honest conversation can do that. He stepped aside, allowing Valerie to take the podium. The room tensed visibly. For many in the audience, this was the villain of the story about to speak. Valerie took a deep breath. "My name is Valerie Peterson. 3 months ago, I humiliated my company's founder because of assumptions I made based on how he looked. I didn't see a successful businessman. I didn't see a military veteran. I saw only what my biases allowed me to see." Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued. "I could have lost my job. Most people in Mr. Reynolds' position would have fired me immediately. Instead, he asked me a simple question. Why did you assume I didn't belong?" She looked out at the audience. That question changed my life, because for the first time, I had to confront biases I never even knew I carried. Assumptions I made without thinking. Judgments that had become automatic. A murmur ran through the crowd as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing something of themselves in her words. Over these past 3 months, I've helped train every employee at this company. I've told my story hundreds of times. And every time, I see the same recognition in people's eyes. The realization that they too carry biases they've never examined. She gestured to a group of people seated in the front row. These are our new Dignity Ambassadors, employees from every level of the company who will continue this training program. Because this isn't a one-time fix, it's an ongoing commitment. Anthony returned to stand beside her. Today, we're also announcing that Horizon Airways is partnering with 15 other airlines to implement similar programs throughout the industry. Because no one should feel they don't belong because of how they look, what they wear, or who they are. He turned to face Valerie directly. "Thank you for having the courage to stand up and own your mistake. Thank you for helping turn a moment of shame into a movement for change." The applause began slowly, then built until it filled the room. In the back, Captain Lee nodded his approval, standing tall in his uniform. As the event concluded and people began to file out, a young black woman in a Horizon Airways pilot uniform approached Anthony. "Mr. Reynolds, I just wanted to say thank you. I've been flying for 8 years, and I still get questioned every time I walk through first class to the cockpit. People assume I'm lost or in the wrong place." She smiled. "Maybe now that will happen a little less often." Anthony shook her hand. "Captain Taylor," she supplied. "Lisa Taylor, Captain Taylor, I hope you're right. But if it does happen again, I hope you'll report it. Real change only happens when we shine a light on these moments." As they spoke, a group of executives from other airlines approached, eager to discuss implementing the program with their own companies. Valerie stood nearby, still looking somewhat overwhelmed by the positive response. "You did well today," Anthony told her as he prepared to meet with the executives. "I still don't understand why you gave me this chance," she replied. "Most people would have just moved on." Anthony looked around the room at the pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and office staff who made up Horizon Airways. "When I left the military, I promised myself I'd build something that mattered, something that would outlast me." He gestured to the training materials being packed up, the Dignity ambassadors chatting excitedly about next steps, the industry representatives discussing how to implement similar programs. "This is it," he said simply. "This is what matters. Not just an airline, but a place where people learn to see each other. Really see each other." Valerie nodded, finally understanding. "Thank you for seeing me," she said quietly. "Not just what I did wrong, but what I could do right." 6 months later, a man in a business suit boarded a Horizon Airways flight and settled into his first-class seat. The flight attendant, a young man with a warm smile, approached. "Welcome aboard, sir. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" The businessman looked up, recognizing Anthony immediately. "Mr. Reynolds, I didn't expect to see you in the cabin today." Anthony smiled. "I try to fly on our routes regularly. Best way to make sure we're living up to our promises." The flight attendant didn't react to the name, treating Anthony exactly as he would any other passenger, with respect, but no special deference. As the plane took off, Anthony looked out the window at the clouds below. The Respect in Flight program had now been adopted by 23 airlines across the country. Valerie had been promoted to head of customer experience training. And just last week, a major industry association had recognized Horizon Airways for its leadership in creating inclusive spaces. One difficult moment, transformed by courage and honesty, had created ripples that continued to spread. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Sometimes, Anthony thought as the plane climbed higher, the most important journeys weren't about destinations at all, but about how we treated each other along the way.